All right, welcome everyone to AER Live, a new series of online interactive workshops from Applied Ecology Resources, or AER. I'm Mark Cadott. I'm the chair of AER, and I'm glad that you're all here to join us today for our first workshop. AER is a globally accessible open platform that makes preserving, sharing, discovering information on the management of biodiversity and environment easier for everyone in the ecological community. At the heart of AER, we also have a new peer-reviewed open access journal, Ecological Solutions and Evidence, and you can read the first issue, which is out now. We are broadcasting these free online workshops for applied ecologists in research and practice as we prepare for the launch of the fully searchable database on AER later this year. Find out more by visiting appliedecologyresources.org. We'd like to thank our two sponsors for today's AER Live workshop, Ecology Resources Limited, a specialist ecological consultancy firm who fund the BS Ecology the Next Generation bursary scheme. This bursary supports 4 young ecologists from low-income backgrounds to study and begin their careers in applied ecology. We'd also like to thank NHBS, our other sponsor, the UK-based supplier of books and equipment for ecologists. Details of their services and their exclusive offer for AER Live viewers will be provided as a slide at the end of this workshop. I'll shortly hand over to our speaker, Harriet Downey, who's giving today's talk. But let me first quickly say that we are recording the talk and will post the video online. During the workshop, there will be a few polls to interact with if you would like to participate. And please submit questions during the workshop using the Zoom chat box, and we'll pick a couple of those to ask our speaker during the Q&A at the end of the talk. Without any longer, let me introduce today's speaker, Harriet Downey, who's coming to us from the Conservation Science Group at the University of Cambridge. She'll be talking about data to decisions, integrating scientific evidence into conservation decision making. All yours, Harriet.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, everybody. I'll just share my screen with you now. Here we go. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you all for coming along. As Mark said, my name is Harriet, and I'm a researcher at the Conservation Science Group at the University of Cambridge. And one of my main roles is to work with practitioners and other people who work in conservation to understand how they use scientific evidence in their work and what challenges they face when trying to use it. And often we end up co-producing, co-designing solutions to overcome those barriers. So one of the things we talk about a lot is how to incorporate scientific evidence into decision making, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'd like to start by saying, as I'm sure you all know, decision making is really, really complicated. There's often really lots of competing factors to consider, limited time and resources, multiple opinions to consider, and people have so many decisions to make, and each of those decisions have a multitude of factors associated with them. So there isn't, unfortunately, a one-size-fits-all solution to decision making. But I'm hoping I'll be able to provide some general principles and point you in the directions of some tools and resources that will help you with this. So I do want to start with a poll. And I just want to ask, in your decision making, in your job, what is the main factor that you have to take into account? And if you're not a decision maker at the moment, what would you think might be the main factor you'd have to take into account? So I'm just launching the poll now, and hopefully everyone can start voting. So you can just click on one of the options there, and I'll run it for 15-20 seconds or so and see what we've got. Okay, I think I'll stop the polling there. So now, and share the results. So hopefully everybody can see that. So we've got a good spread of what people say they take into account: scientific evidence, knowledge and expert opinion, the feasibility of what you do. So if I stop sharing the results, hopefully that's popped off your screen, but if not, you can minimize it. So, of course, I'm sure everybody knows we actually need to take all of those factors into account when we're making our decisions. So the local knowledge, any Indigenous and traditional knowledge, your experience and any expert opinion, social values and cultures, and any values of the organisation, economic costs and resources play a huge role in decision making, as well as the feasibility. And then, of course, there's the scientific evidence to take into consideration as well. And because I am talking about evidence-based decision-making, I just wanted to give a definition of what I mean by that. So evidence is any information, relevant information that you would use to assess one or more of your hypotheses related to your question. And scientific evidence is referring to that information that's been collected using a scientific method. So this might be published peer-reviewed studies or unpublished studies and reports as well. And why is it important to use evidence-based decision-making? Well, it helps facilitate the systematic collation and synthesis of evidence. It increases the quality of evidence we have available for decisions. It helps to reduce bias and cherry picking. It increases the transparency of the decisions. The effectiveness of the management is increased, and it also helps you to identify gaps in the knowledge. And so evidence-based decision-making is really, it's all about the explicit integration of all of those pieces of information that we went through earlier. So why is using scientific evidence important in decisions? I just want to give a couple of examples of where scientific evidence isn't used or misused for you to see. So those of you that are from the UK might recognise these structures. These are bat gantries. And these are put in on when new roads are built as a mitigation strategy, with the idea being that bats will use them and avoid collisions with traffic. And there was a study done in 2012 that tested how well these worked, and they found that bats pretty much don't use them on a whole range of designs. But even despite this study coming out about 8 years ago, they're still used in the UK today. So far, over £2.5 million has been spent on them, and they're not reducing bat mortality. Equally, if we look at human-wildlife conflict, a commonly used method is to translocate predators away from residential areas. And most studies have found that this actually doesn't reduce the amount of conflict. Most animals tend to move back into the area, and some studies have even found that translocated leopards attack more humans and livestock than before translocation. So this shows even something that seems like a common sense method really needs to be trialled and tested if we're going to use it. So that shows that often in a lot of decisions that are made, scientific evidence isn't used. So lots of studies have tried to look at what information is used by conservation practitioners. And this is one of those studies by Carly Cook and her colleagues. And they showed that experience was more often used than scientific evidence on Australian reserves. And this isn't a solo finding. So if we look at studies of the research practice interface, we often find that scientific papers on conservation assessments don't lead to implementation of actions. Decision makers in the UK often don't use scientific papers when they're compiling their management reserve plans. In Australia, again, this is the same study from Carly Cook, 10% of conservation managers use scientific evidence. In a study from the UK again, only 2.4% of the information used was the scientific literature. And only around 20% of conservation professionals in Switzerland used scientific journals in their decision making. But studies have also shown that most conservation decision makers do want practical advice that is grounded in the best available evidence and typically value the advice given to them by scientists. So why is it that they're not using it? So I'm going to try and run this second poll now. And yeah, if people could answer, you can pick multiple ones on this poll. So what stops you using scientific evidence? Or if you're not yet a decision maker, what would you imagine stops you using scientific evidence? So hopefully this second poll works. So again, we'll run this for maybe 30 seconds and you can pick multiple options on this one and we'll see what happens at the end. Okay, great. I think I'll just end the polling there and share the results. So you can see pretty much, yeah, all of the factors have been voted for, with access being the main one. Time, jargon, uncertainty, your organizational structural values, not having the right evidence, and also language barriers. So again, I'm going to stop sharing the results, but if you can still see the poll, you can just minimize that on your screen. And yeah, studies have shown that there's a whole swathe of reasons why people don't use evidence. And you can see on here, this is from work by Jessica Walsh. Lack of access to research is a big factor. The science doesn't exist for the particular issue. Organizational management and structure, and poor academic practitioner relationships, amongst other things. So if we want people to be using scientific evidence in their decision making, evidence use has to be made easier. And there are a couple of things that are happening to try and achieve this. So evidence synthesis was one of those. As I'm sure you're all aware, there's a huge amount of literature out there. A ISI citation report has suggested that over 12,000 articles are published annually in the field of ecology alone. So even if you read 2 articles a day, you would fall behind 17 years of literature in just 1 year. So we really need something to help people stay on top of the literature. And this is where evidence synthesis can play a role. So to put it very simply, evidence synthesis is a method that would take all of the relevant studies needed to answer a question. It goes through a rigorous process, and there's a few different ways evidence synthesis can be done. And at the end, it would produce one report or summary or paper to read. So obviously this saves a huge amount of time, as you know, to not spent searching the literature and reading all of the papers. It can help overcome jargon barriers, language barriers if the synthesis includes information from multiple languages. And so it's a really, really useful tool for decision making. And another thing that we can look for is decision support tools. And these are things that are usually software based, and they illustrate possible outcomes of decisions visually or numerically, or they lead users through logical decision steps. And there's a variety of these available. So one example I'm going to use is from What Works in Conservation. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's produced annually by the Conservation Evidence Project, and you can get it as a book or download it as a PDF for free, or just access the information on the website. So if, for example, you were interested in understanding whether providing artificial nesting sites for songbirds was a good idea, you could look on that action on the Conservation Evidence website. You would find that there's 66 studies that provide evidence for that, and they're summarized individually. Once those studies have been summarized, they go to an expert assessment panel who use a Delphi method, which is a series of voting, and they're given scores for effectiveness, certainty, and harms, and then they're put into a category on whether their action is likely to be beneficial, unknown, or maybe even ineffective or harmful, and so on. And this can give you a really nice, quick visual idea of what that action, the evidence behind that action. So for example, if you were looking again on the website and you wanted to know how well artificial nesting sites work for different kinds of bird species, you could see that they're beneficial for songbirds, likely to be beneficial for raptors, but it's still unknown effectiveness because of limited evidence for woodpeckers specifically. So even though this is based on 11 studies, we're still not really sure whether they work or not, but this provides a really nice visual cue for decision makers. And so these sort of tools for decision making have been described in a 4S hierarchy by Lynn Dix and colleagues. So you've got your studies, reviews, summaries, and your decision support tools, which along with experience and guidance can help you make a decision. And these all feed back into the evidence pool as well. So those are some of the tools that are helping make evidence use easier. So now I just want to go through a few general principles of integrating scientific evidence into decision making. And like I said previously, there isn't a one size fits all. And so I'm just going to provide some ideas and some tools and resources to help make this easier. So the first thing, which might seem quite contradictory after me saying that it's really important to use scientific evidence, is that sometimes you need to prioritize when you're going to use scientific evidence. And this is well recognized in decision analysis as a field. If somebody has hundreds or thousands of decisions to make annually, it's really unlikely that you're going to have the time to do a thorough evidence review for each of those decisions. And often decisions can be broken down into some different categories. So there's some what we might call no-brainers, which might be pretty quick and easy to answer without looking at the evidence, or they're of little consequence. So for these, managers might be able to rely on their expertise or the expertise of their colleagues to make these decisions. And then there'll be some decisions that it is really worth consulting the evidence for. But again, these might be broken down into those that really only need a brief evidence review. And this might be something that, again, you're very certain on and that there's a lot of evidence around that topic, or something that needs a really thorough evidence review. And this is likely in the case of something where you're dealing with a novel action or a novel species, for example, a new invasive species. If you're dealing with a high risk project, so maybe translocation project, or if it's something that is going to create public concern. So again, like I said, even though this seems contradictory, this can be really helpful in making evidence-based decisions, and it can help make the whole process seem less overwhelming when you've got all of those decisions to make. And secondly, having a structured process is really important. It's been shown that often when people are making decisions, they might just do it in their head, or they might do it just with the knowledge that they have, instead of going through a specific process, scanning all of the options, and bringing together all of the relevant knowledge, so things might be missed. And having a structured process helps avoid this. And there's a few types of structured processes. These are just three, for example. So you can have what's called simply structured decision making. And this is particularly helpful when you have groups making decisions. You can work together on solutions that will be rigorous and defendable and transparent, but you're also able to incorporate your values as well as the evidence with those processes. There's multi-criteria decision making, and here you're able to evaluate multiple conflicting criteria, which often you have to if you're thinking about costs and things like that. And then a third type of structured process is risk analysis, where you try and understand the significance of a risk and then decide what kind of management it needs, what that might cost, and implement it to reduce the risk to an acceptable residual level. And at Conservation Evidence, we're actually at the moment trying to develop a very simple decision-making tool that you might use when deciding on specific management actions. And it's just a step-by-step process where you would fill in the prompt boxes across all of the tabs, and you'd be able to download a summary report at the end. And this production of a summary report is something else that's really important, because a lot of people carry really important knowledge in their head, and when decisions are made, it's made from that. But if somebody leaves a project and they take all of that information with them, there's no way of really knowing how that decision was made. So having this sort of paper trail of decisions is vital. And we're actually looking for testers and collaborators for this tool to continue developing it. So if anybody's interested in helping us trial and improve this tool, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. So another thing to consider is whether you're including the right people in your decision making, because you really need a range of people who collectively have the expertise and knowledge to make well-informed decisions. So this would include your site-based practitioners, your line managers and other advisors, scientists and the local community. And that can be particularly important if a decision you're making is going to affect the local community, or if you need their buy-in in order for it to be successful. So if you're going to plant lots of trees and you need the local community to keep up maintenance and watering, you really need to involve all the appropriate stakeholders right from the beginning to ensure that everybody is happy with the decision, and it's likely to be more effective if you do so. And And I think it's also important to not feel constrained by what you already do. A lot of the time people will be making decisions based on just what they know instead of comparing all of the potential options available. So there's a method called solution scanning that helps you look for all of these options. And I can sort of demonstrate how you might do it on the conservation evidence database. So for example, if you were looking for actions to help you reduce chytrid, you could type that into the database, and that would give you all the different actions that experts have identified that would help reduce chytrid in populations. And when you click on those specific actions, it will take you to any related actions there as well. So it helps you sort of move beyond what you might already be doing. And it's really important to adaptively manage in your decisions as well. And this might be particularly true if there is no evidence available for your decision. So it's fine to make assumptions and to go ahead and make a decision where there's no evidence, but you really need to be able to monitor and test those assumptions and adapt accordingly. And adaptive management is becoming much more popular in the conservation movement, and the conservation measures partnerships and the Open Standards for Conservation, this website down here has lots of really excellent resources about using these adaptive management techniques in your work. And that sort of links through to generating your own evidence, because a lot of conservation actions do lack sufficient evidence, and so decisions have to be made on incomplete or inaccurate information. And if they were routinely tested and the results shared with the wider community, it would increase the effectiveness of lots of conservation actions. And often with small changes to projects and not a huge extra cost, you should be able to incorporate tests into your project. So I think Nancy Ockenden will be talking in this series in a couple of months about testing in conservation projects. So she'll have a lot to say on how you can do that. And finally, an important thing to remember is to try and avoid bias and bypasses. Everyone will have some type of bias in their decision making, and I think this can be particularly true in conservation, which is a passion-driven subject. So it's important to challenge your bias and really consider why do you think that this is going to work? And there's some techniques that people use for this. It can be as simple as devil's advocate, and this is where you get a colleague to continually challenge the decisions you're making. It can be slightly more in depth than that. You can conduct what are called project pre-mortems. So your team would imagine that your project has failed, and you work backwards from that failure and try and imagine all the reasons why that happened. And then something that's slightly more technical is forecasting, when you consider the possible outcomes of your decision and then check the degree to which these outcomes are achieved. So those are sort of some things that I think are really important to consider in your decision making, but you obviously also need to know where to find the evidence. And of course, there's always primary studies and your own group's internal reports. But for evidence syntheses, like I said earlier, there's a couple of places you can go to. So there's the Centre for Environmental Evidence, and this group produces systematic reviews and maps on a variety of subjects within environmental sciences. So for example, this is the latest 3 that they've produced, and they cover a wide range of subjects. There's the Conservation Evidence Project, which summarises the evidence for management interventions. And at the moment, they've got over 2,000 actions summarised from nearly 7,000 studies. And they'll be continually adding to the database to cover all species and habitats in the next few years. And of course, very soon we'll have the Applied Ecology Resources database, which will provide lots of information from various different sources. And there's lots more out there. So CABI for invasive species and the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative as well. And I think it's also, if you have the time, it can be good to check individual organisations' websites for their grey literature reports. So often governmental organisations or NGOs will put some grey literature reports on their website that you can find more information on. And so once you've got hold of the evidence, it's still important to scrutinise it before you apply it to your decision. And there's a few things to consider when you're doing that. And one of the things is the source. So where did that information come from? Is it a peer-reviewed article? Is it expert opinion or journalism and media? And what's the type of evidence that's being provided? Is it an evidence synthesis of multiple studies? Is it an experimental piece or observational, or is it just anecdote? And it's also important to think about the strength of the evidence. Was the result strongly positive or only weakly positive or mixed? And if there's uncertainty in the results, how does that affect how you use it in your decision? The quality of evidence is related to type, but you also need to think about sample size and experimental design used. Alec Christie has done some work recently about how experimental design affects the robustness of ecological studies, which is a really interesting read. And then the quantity of evidence. Are there lots of sources or just one? And how does this affect the reliability of the evidence? And then finally, the relevance. Is the evidence specific to the statement that you're interested, or is it indirectly related? And this also counts for whether it's focusing on the exact species or habitat you're interested in, or related species or functionally related species. And it's also important maybe to think about the geography or the biome of where the study was conducted as well. So I think those are sort of my tips and guidance on how you can incorporate scientific evidence into your decisions. But I do think there's still some way to go in the future to make it easier for people to use. So I think, first of all, strengthening researcher-practitioner relationships is really important to help us use scientific evidence better, because often research agendas are set by the academic community. And so practitioners will find that when they're looking for answers for their questions, they're just not there. So having this two-way interaction between researchers and practitioners can really help fill in the knowledge gaps. And also, I think it's helpful for researchers to be able to better understand the context in which practitioners are making decisions. Because there's often lots of conflicting things for them to think about, and it might quickly become obvious why scientific evidence isn't always the priority of practitioners. I think it's still important to make scientific evidence more accessible. We're getting there with the databases I mentioned, and we're having access to grey literature, but organisations sharing their literature and more open access will help with this. Sorry, I think I can hear somebody else talking in the background. It put me off a second. And then finally, influencing organisational norms, because in a lot of organisations, using scientific evidence isn't a priority for a number of reasons. But if we want to be making these robust decisions, I think it is important. A lot of these processes and tools aren't there to make your life harder. They're there to hopefully help make more effective decisions and make the projects more effective as well. But influencing those organisational norms and making evidence use expected will really help to overcome this. So yeah, in summary, I'd just like to say that I don't think it's any surprise that making decisions in conservation is really challenging. We're trying to link this ever-growing body of knowledge through to complex and changing politics and situations, and also the conservation community is not centralised and it's spread all over the globe. So it is a challenge. But I think evidence-based decision-making can really help us in this. It helps to avoid bias and increase transparency, as well as increasing the effectiveness of the decisions. And we have these syntheses and decision support tools, which present evidence in a way that's easy to understand and is accessible. But I do think it's important to remind ourselves that scientific evidence is just one factor within a decision. But solutions to improve research use include changes by individuals and institutions. And I think collaborations and knowledge exchange between scientists and decision makers is one of the key ways that we might achieve this. So I'll stop there and say thank you for listening, and I'll be very happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Harriet, for a wonderful presentation. Judging by the comments that are coming in, I think a lot of people really appreciate what you've explained to us today. I'll just remind all the participants that if you have questions, please put it into the chat box, simply because there's 150 people here. If everyone tries to talk, I think it'll be a little difficult. And I can see lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to do my best to summarize some of them on the fly. Some of the questions that have come in have been great, because they're really thinking about some of the tools and strategies you've presented, and thinking about how to use them in other ways. And so I'll go through some of the questions quickly. So one person, Professor Chioma Chikere, was asking very specifically about soil microbial systems and restoration ecosystem services. So obviously an important area for us to understand, but their concern was about the lack of information. And I think the way I would frame the question then is, with some of these tools from, say, conservation evidence, is there a way to overcome some systematic biases to communicate gaps and to sort of foment research around certain areas that where we just do not know enough?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things that often comes, when specifically at conservation evidence, when we do a synthesis, we often find that for a lot of actions you might take, there's simply no evidence. And that can be a really big problem when people want to know what to do. And there is a way you can go on the website and you can filter and find which actions have no studies. And from that, you can create a list of what might be priority questions to address. So I know somebody in our group is doing this with primates at the moment. They are taking all of the evidence gaps that are there, and they're working with the IUCN specialist group to come up with a list of priority research questions specifically for primates. But I think that's really important, and I think synthesis can really help us identify those gaps. And then if we can get this dialogue between researchers and practitioners to say, well, here's the gaps, this is what we really need to know, we should be able to start filling them in. And if you have the resources within your own organisation to undertake the research yourself, I think that can be really helpful as well. I think, like I said, Nancy is going to be talking in November, I think, about testing in your projects as well. And sometimes simple tweaks to project can really help build up the knowledge and fill those gaps. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I'm noticing that a number of people are commenting or suggesting other sources of information, etc. One thing I'll say to those people is that we're going to summarize a lot of these points, and maybe we can have a summary of some of the gaps and other sources of information. So there's been a couple of questions about potentially some of the biases when we synthesize information. So for one person, or a couple people were asking about how to account for publication biases when you're synthesizing this information. Another person, Vincinius, mentioned the sort of the north-south divide and where information is coming from. Can you say a little bit about how to deal with maybe some biases in the information that comes into forming these syntheses?
Yeah, so yeah, I think that's totally right. I think, again, I mentioned some of the work Alec Christie is doing, and he's recently released some papers about where there are gaps and biases in the literature. So you often find these big spatial information gaps, the north-south divide, like you say, or taxonomic. If you compare the information that's available for birds versus amphibians, it's really different. And also, yeah, then you have publication bias to take into account as well. And I think this is when you're doing syntheses, I guess if the information isn't there, if it's not available, if you're conducting a synthesis yourself, it might not be possible to do anything but try and fill those gaps yourself. But I think also trying to do syntheses, taking into account other languages. And I know that Kokono and Tatsuya Amano are doing some really brilliant work on that, showing that when you start incorporating other languages or leaving out certain languages, it can really change the results of these syntheses. So looking for other language, I think, is really important. And then, sorry, was there a second part of the question that I might have missed?
I think that's great. I see some more questions coming in about publication biases, and especially ones that might be overstating the results, or just a general publication bias towards positive results instead of negative or neutral results.
Yeah, which obviously is a huge problem. And one of the projects we working on at Conservation Evidence with a lot of other people is discussing that particular aspect. And I think lots of people have a role to play in that. So journals have a role to play in encouraging people to publish non-significant results. And there are journals out there that do that. So Applied Ecology Resources Associated one, that Ecological Solutions and Evidence, the Conservation Evidence Journal, and then various other journals have sort of types of articles that are specifically for that. So I think making people aware that there are places to publish that information. And I think also greater sharing of the grey literature is really important. If people feel confident to publish this literature saying that it didn't work without necessarily going through the peer review process, I think that's great. And I think also funders have a really big role to play in that as well, in telling the people that they're funding that they want to know about this, because it's just as important to know what doesn't work as well as what does. So I think several players have a role in that. And I think we're moving somewhere with the journals. And I think as a community, people seem more willing to share what went wrong, which is great. But yeah, I think maybe we need to be a bit more confident about doing that. And I think lots of people talk about framing it as learning instead of failure. And I think seeing it in that positive light could really help as well.
Yeah, and I also think that some of the specific syntheses you talked about in systematic reviews, I think they try to be robust in that they're not going to say there's a lot of evidence when it's just a few studies that are
Exactly.
that made some observation, but instead they want to see what the weight of evidence is.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Philippe Mello, and he's so he puts this in the context of post-truth and sort of maybe problematic decisions that are based on incomplete or erroneous information. But what he's asking, I think, is a really interesting aspect of especially the tool you're showing, where people can enter their information into boxes and come up with a sort of a summary of that. Could some of these tools be used post hoc? So after to sort of dissect some decisions that have already been made or some management options to, is there value in using these tools to go back and say, how did we come to these decisions, and what could we have done differently?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think, like I was saying, the importance of documenting that in a very specific manner, because often people don't document them. They make decisions and then they go and implement it. And afterwards, if it doesn't work, it's sometimes unclear what all the pieces were that made you get to that decision. And I think with that tool, we're hoping people will use it both for planning, but also for, adaptively managing or looking back at a project and thinking about what went wrong and why, and how you might adjust that. And also incorporating the idea of how do you know when to end a project? When do you decide that it's not working and you move on and you try something different? And I think a lot of those tools can be used for, the sort of project post-mortem, picking it apart and seeing why it might have failed.
Yeah, that's a really interesting use of it. I actually have a question of my own that came up when you were talking about the use of primary literature by practitioners. I don't know if you know, I haven't seen any analysis, but with the advent and expansion of open access, Is there any evidence that that there's been a greater uptake or use or access of open access literature by practitioners, or that the perception is that that barrier is being reduced?
I'm actually not aware of any literature, but that would be really interesting, wouldn't it?
Well,
Um,
it's interesting because that's kind of one of the arguments of open access and its expansion is that it allows for universal access. So barriers to access should be reduced, but
mhm.
is the perception changed about access of the literature? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think another important thing is even just because something is open access, people still have to be aware of it in order to use it. And I think sometimes we're not very good at communicating that these tools and resources are there for people to use. So hopefully through series like these workshops and with applied ecology resources, promoting all the different things, yeah, it could make a difference in people just becoming aware of these resources as well.
Yeah, great. I'll ask one more question, and I think this one just came in from Julia Cardon. Um, and I think this is actually a really good one that I hadn't thought about. So when you talked about the various tools and synthesizing information, what she's asking about is integrating information from social sciences. And so we're often looking at very empirical type of biological or ecological information in these syntheses. But with some of these tools and some of these approaches, is there a way to bring in information, social science, economic, other types of information that could go into decision making?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of them do allow you to incorporate that. And I think, as she quite rightly said, it's really important to. With social sciences, it can obviously be slightly different. I'm not aware of many databases that synthesize social science, which can obviously be difficult because it tends to be qualitative and it's a lot about interpretation and things like that. But there is I'm going to struggle to remember the name of the group that's specifically working on this now, but I can find the link and share it. Who have specifically looked at the humanitarian section and conservation for community-based programs, and they're looking at how do you incorporate social and ecological sciences together, and it's more about feedback loops and things like that. So I'll try and find. They've produced a few really interesting documents about that. But yeah, I think there's definitely tools and processes out there available, and I think there's a lot of encouragement to start using that as well. So I think yeah, we'll start seeing more of that as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I can second how difficult it is. I have a group here going over 50 years of agency decisions, and it's a much more somewhat much more difficult process
Yeah.
than sort of some of the ecological measures we use. So with that, I'm cognizant of time, and that brings our first AR workshop to a close. Thank you so much, Harriet. That was wonderful. And I keep seeing in people's comments when they're asking their questions that they're reiterating that they really appreciate your presentation in this workshop. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm just going to share my screen. All right, so as I said, that brings our first AR Live workshop to a close, and thank you very much, Harriet, and thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for your wonderful questions. There's a lot of chat and questions that have been submitted to us, and people also have been asking about the availability of this presentation. This has been recorded and will be posted, so you'll get an email link telling you where that's located and how you can access it as well. So our next workshop will be on Thursday, the 22nd of October, with ecological consultant Matthew Bowell giving his talk, Exchanging Knowledge Through Great Literature, Guidance and Encouragement for Contributors from Outside Academia. This talk will be of particular interest for ecological practitioners, and registration for the next month's workshop is now open. If you enjoyed this talk, why not get more involved with AER by visiting the website and following us on Twitter and LinkedIn for the latest updates. Finally, I'll leave you with the details of the offer from our sponsor of today's AER Live workshop, and HBS, so you can take full advantage. And HBS supply equipment and books for ecologists and conservation professionals, and they are offering free European shipping for AER Live viewers until the end of September. Thank you very much, and see you again next month.